The first crack in the wall of absolute belief did not appear with a bang, but with a whisper of steam, the gentle patter of hot water on tile, and the crisp, clean, almost aggressive scent of lemon soap. It was a scent that did not belong to the world of 1944, not in Europe, not for a German woman who had spent the last 5 years measuring her life in ration coupons in the grim gray bars of lye soap that smelled of nothing but poverty and war. Her name was Elizabeth, but in that moment she was not a name, she was a collection of shattered expectations. She had been told with the relentless certainty of state radio and the grim faces of party officials that the Americans were monsters, that they were cruel, that they took pleasure in the suffering of their prisoners, that the concept of mercy was as foreign to them as peace itself. She believed this. It was not a political opinion, it was the bedrock of her reality, the dark water in which she had learned to swim. When the transport truck rattled to a halt at the American-run camp, she braced herself. She prepared for the cold, for the slap, for the hollow-eyed stare of a captor who saw her as less than human. What she received was a nod, a silent gesture toward a barracks that was unbelievably clean. The floors were swept, the windows, though wire-reinforced, let in light, and on each cot, a towel, a simple, clean cotton towel. It was this towel that formed the first dissonance. It was an object of care, not control. The guard who led them did not shout. He spoke in clear, if accented, German. The showers are there. Hot water is available until 2100 hours. Hot water. He said it as if it were a normal thing, as if it were not a miracle. The shower room was a temple of steam. The air was thick with it, and cut through it was that impossible scent. Lemon, real lemon, like a fruit from a forgotten world. The bar of soap was a smooth, creamy yellow. She took it. The solid weight of it in her palm was shocking. It was not a fragment, not a sliver rationed out. It was a whole bar, hers to use. She stepped under the stream. The water hit her skin, and for a second it was pain, a pure, scorching sensation she had literally forgotten could exist. Then it became warmth, a deep, penetrating warmth that seeped into muscles clenched for years in anticipation of sirens and blows. She began to wash. The lather was rich. It smelled of sunshine and orchards. It smelled of a life before the war. And as she washed, she wept. The tears mixed with the shower water and streamed down her face. This was not the crying of sorrow. This was the physical reaction of a system in shock. Her body, her nervous system, was encountering a fundamental contradiction. The data provided by her senses, the heat, the scent, the gentle pressure of the water, was in violent, irreconcilable conflict with the data provided by years of propaganda. One of them had to be false, and her body in its animal wisdom was choosing the truth of the hot water. It was believing the soap. This was the insidious, brilliant first strike in the American campaign. It was a strike that bypassed the intellect entirely and went straight for the primal physical self. You can fortify a mind against arguments. You can train a heart to resist appeals to emotion. But how do you armor your skin against warmth? How do you convince your nose that a sweet smell is actually a foul one? The propaganda machine was built on words and images. It was no match for a direct assault on the senses. As Elizabeth stood there, clean for the first time in half a decade, a single thought formed, clear and cold as the lemon scent in the steam. They lied to me. Not a mistake, not a misunderstanding, a deliberate, sustained lie. And if they lied about this, about the basic humanity of the enemy, what else was a lie? The crack was no longer a hairline fracture. It was a split running right down the middle of her world. She turned off the water. The silence was sudden. She dried herself with the clean towel. The fabric was soft. She walked back to her bunk, her skin tingling, her hair damp, her mind reeling. The other women moved around her, similar expressions of stunned silence on their faces. No one spoke. There were no words for this. The only sound was the drip of water from pipes and the distant, ordinary sound of Americans talking in the hallway. The war outside was still raging, but here, in this room, a different kind of victory had just been won. A victory so quiet, so personal, that no medal would ever be struck for it. It was the victory of a bar of soap over a mountain of hateful words. And it was only the beginning, because tomorrow the Americans would deploy their next weapon. It would not be in the shower room, it would be in the dining hall, and it would be served on a plate. The weapon they served on a plate was not what anyone expected. It was not grand, it was not heroic, it was almost laughably simple. It was routine. The predictable, gentle, monotonous rhythm of a day that held no surprises beyond its own quiet benevolence. The morning did not come with a siren. It came with a soft gray light at the windows, and then a knock, a firm but polite rap on the barracks door. The voice that followed was calm, speaking German with a heavy American accent. 30 minutes to breakfast. And then the footsteps would recede. For women whose nervous systems had been tuned for years to the scream of air raid alarms, this gentle announcement was a form of culture shock. It implied a world where time was something to be measured in minutes to a meal, not in seconds to take cover. The next 30 minutes unfolded with a serene predictability that felt, in its own way, more disorienting than chaos. They would make their beds, not just throw a blanket over crumpled sheets, but properly make them, tucking corners, smoothing surfaces. The towels from the night before were collected, replaced with fresh ones that smelled of wind and sun, as if they had been dried outside. There was a quiet dignity in this act, a message whispered in linen. You are worthy of a made bed. You are worthy of a clean start. Then came the walk to the mess hall. There was no shoving, no frantic rush born of the fear that the food would run out. They walked in a line, slowly, some still limping from old injuries or new weakness. The hall itself was a study in order. Long tables, wiped clean, plates, real ceramic plates, white and unchipped, were already set at each place. Beside each plate lay a fork, a knife, a spoon, polished. This simple set of cutlery was another quiet shock. In the Germany they had left, cutlery was scarce, often shared, always utilitarian. Here, each person had their own. It was an assertion of individuality and a system they had been taught valued only the collective. And then the food arrived. It was not a slop ladled from a bucket. It was served onto the plates by American servicemen. There was white bread, sliced. Not the dense, dark Creek's bread that sat in the stomach like a stone, but soft, pillowy bread that yielded to the touch. There was butter, real butter, pale yellow and creamy, not the greasy margarine that was the wartime standard. There was jam, strawberry jam, with actual seeds visible in the red gel. And there was coffee, real coffee. The smell alone was a time machine, transporting some of the older women back to pre-war cafes and Sunday mornings. Then a small accident. A young guard, balancing too many trays, fumbled. A metal cup of coffee clattered to the floor, brown liquid pooling on the clean tiles. The women froze, expecting fury. Instead, the guard's face flushed red. He let out a short, embarrassed laugh. "Oops," he said, in clumsy but clear German. Then he fetched him up. He cleaned it himself. No shouting, no punishment. Just a man who spilled his coffee and cleaned his mess. In that ordinary moment, another layer of the monster myth peeled away. The first bite was an act of courage. The first sip was a leap of faith. Lena, a former schoolteacher from Dresden, would later write in her diary, "I put the bread in my mouth and I waited for the trick, for the taste to be ash, for it to be poisoned with bitterness. But it was just bread. Sweet, soft, perfect bread. I chewed and I felt a pain in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart. It was the pain of a memory waking up. The memory of being a person, not a resource." This was the second front in the American campaign, the normalization of care. The showers had been a shocking, singular event, but this, the daily bread, the daily coffee, the daily ritual of a clean fork on a clean plate, this was a sustained assault. It made kindness boring. It made decency routine. And in doing so, it made the propaganda of American cruelty seem not just false, but absurd. How could the monster who served you strawberry jam with a straight face be the same monster who bayoneted babies? The cognitive dissonance was staggering, and it was engineered to be so. The guards did not interact much, but when they did, it was with a detached professionalism that was, in its own way, a relief. They were not trying to be friends, they were not trying to convert. They were simply doing a job, and part of that job seemed to be ensuring that the prisoners were fed, clean, and left in peace. This lack of overt manipulation was perhaps the most manipulative thing of all. It allowed the prisoners' own minds to draw the conclusions. It allowed trust to grow like a weed in cracked concrete, unplanned, unstoppable. By the end of the first week, the tense silence in the barracks had softened. Women began to speak to each other, not in whispers of conspiracy, but in murmurs of confusion. "Did your bread have butter today?" The coffee was strong. The guard by the door, the young one, he nodded at me. These were not political statements. They were sensory reports, and each report was a tiny hammer tap on the shell of the lie they had lived inside. The Americans were not preaching democracy. They were serving it, one bland, predictable meal at a time. They were demonstrating a philosophy where the state, even a military state guarding prisoners, had a duty of care. This was a concept so foreign, so radical to women raised in the Third Reich that it bypassed their critical faculties entirely and planted itself as a simple, observable fact. The facts were these. The bed was made, the bread was fresh, the soap was lemon-scented. Everything else was just noise. But the Americans were not done. They had stabilized the body. They had begun to calm the mind. Their next target was the spirit.
And for that, they would use a tool no one saw coming, a tool that required no words at all.
The tool was a hairbrush, a simple wooden-backed hairbrush with sturdy bristles. It was not issued. It appeared one afternoon on the foot of Marta's bunk. Marta was the librarian from Cologne who had not spoken above a whisper since the bombing that destroyed her library and her voice in the same fiery instant. She was a woman made of paper and silence, fading into the gray fabric of her issued dress. She stared at the brush as if it were a puzzle box. There was no note, no explanation. Later, she would learn that a nurse had left it there, the same nurse who checked her pulse every morning, and after taking it, would pause, place a hand on Marta's forehead, and leave it there for a count of 3. It was not a medical necessity. It was a human one, a transfer of warmth, of contact, of the unspoken message. I am here, and you are here, and we are both alive. The hairbrush was an extension of that message. That evening, the nurse returned. She did not ask permission. She simply picked up the brush, sat behind Marta on the bunk, and began to brush her hair. Marta stiffened. The touch was an invasion, a shock after years of touch being either clinical or violent. But the nurse was slow, methodical. She started at the ends, working out the knots with a patience that felt infinite. The rhythmic pull of the bristles through her hair, the gentle scratch on her scalp, it was a sensation so forgotten it felt new. Marta closed her eyes, and then, silently, she began to cry. The tears were hot and silent, streaming down her face as the nurse worked. She was not crying for her lost library, or her lost voice, or even for the war. She was crying for the sheer, unbearable kindness of the act. In that moment, the last vestige of the monstrous American caricature evaporated. A monster does not brush your hair. A monster does not sit in silence with you while you weep. This was the third weapon, and it was the most devastating yet. Personalized, wordless compassion. It targeted the specific injury, the individual ache. It said, I see not just a prisoner, but you, Marta, who was afraid and silent. While this quiet revolution was happening in the barracks, another was taking root just outside. A small fenced-off plot of earth, previously just dirt and weeds, had been turned over. Packets of seeds appeared, carrots, lettuce, marigolds. A few trowels and a watering can were left beside it. No order was given, no work detail was assigned. It was merely made available. At first, the women ignored it. The very idea of gardening felt obscene, a frivolity from a dead world. But one afternoon, an older woman named Gertrude, who had been a botanist before the war, walked over to the plot. She knelt, stiffly, and picked up a handful of soil. She let it run through her fingers. She picked up a packet of carrot seeds, and she began to plant. Her actions were slow, ritualistic. Other women watched from the barracks window. The next day, another woman joined her. Then another. They did not speak much. They just knelt in the dirt, making small holes, dropping in seeds, covering them over. This was not farming. It was therapy. It was an act of faith in a future. It was the body remembering how to nurture instead of how to endure. The Americans, it seemed, understood something the Nazis had missed. To break a person, you attack their agency. To heal them, you must restore it. The garden gave them agency. The hairbrush gave Marta a piece of herself. And in the infirmary, the medicine was not just for bodies. The nurses began to distribute small, blank notebooks and pencils. Again, no instructions. Some women used them to keep tallies of days. Some drew. Some, like Lena, began to write. At first, just lists. Words she remembered. Recipes. Then fragments of memory. Descriptions of the taste of the bread. The sound of the American guards' laugh. A short, barking sound that was so ordinary, it was extraordinary. The notebook became a safe chamber where she could process the cognitive dissonance. Where she could observe. The enemy's hands are clean and his eyes are tired, just like mine. This was the masterstroke. The Americans were not deprogramming them. They were creating the conditions for the women to deprogram themselves. They provided the safety, the silence, the tools, the soap, the bread, the brush, the seeds, the paper. And then they stepped back. The conclusions the women reached were their own, and a conclusion you reach yourself is a conclusion you own. You cannot be argued out of it. It is woven into your lived experience. By the end of the third week, the atmosphere in the camp had transformed. The fear was gone. The tension was gone. It was replaced by a weary, wary, but very real peace. Women sat in the sun, mending clothes. They exchanged a few words about the garden. They even smiled, the expression strange on their faces at first, like muscles long unused. The propaganda machine had been built to operate in an atmosphere of perpetual crisis, of us versus them, of existential threat. It had no mechanism to function in an atmosphere of bland routine and quiet kindness. Its gears, designed to grind out hatred, seized up in the face of strawberry jam and marigold seeds. The Americans had won the psychological war not by fighting the Nazi narrative, but by making it irrelevant. They had changed the subject, and the new subject was as simple as it was profound. What does it mean to be treated like a human being? But the final test, the ultimate proof, was yet to come. It would not happen within the fence. It would happen in the letters they were about to write.
and in the even more dangerous thoughts they were about to carry home.
The letters were the true bombshells, and they were delivered not by bombers, but by the prisoners themselves, using the very pens and paper their captors had provided. It started as a practical matter. The Red Cross had forms, but the Americans, in another stroke of psychological insight, also provided plain stationery. No rules on what could be written, no censors standing over shoulders, just paper, envelopes, and the promise that the mail would go out. For women who had lived under a regime where every word was monitored, where diaries were dangerous and private thoughts were treason, this act of trust was paralyzing. At first, they wrote the safe things. I am alive. I am healthy. The conditions are adequate. But the blank page beneath those sterile lines seemed to accuse them. It asked for truth. And slowly, haltingly, the truth began to spill out. Not the truth of politics or battle lines, but the sensory, mundane, revolutionary truth of their days. Lena wrote to her sister, "The most astonishing thing happened today. I dropped my spoon at breakfast. It clattered on the floor. A young American guard, he cannot be more than 19, picked it up. He walked not to the wash bucket, but to a different cupboard. He took out a clean spoon and handed it to me. A clean spoon, just for me, because mine touched the floor. I could not speak. He nodded and walked away. Muti, they have a cupboard full of clean spoons. What kind of people have a cupboard full of clean spoons for their prisoners?" Elsewhere, Gertrude, the botanist, wrote to her son, "The marigolds are sprouting, little green fists punching through the dark earth. I water them every morning. No one tells me to, no one tells me not to. It is my decision. This small decision, to water a flower, feels like the most important thing I have done in years." These letters did not contain arguments. They contained evidence. They were forensic reports from the front lines of a different reality. When they began to arrive in Germany, passed from hand to hand in shattered cities, they did something no Allied leaflet could do. They bypassed the brain and went straight to the heart. A sister reading about a clean spoon for a prisoner did not think about geopolitics. She thought about her own empty cupboard, her own dirty spoon. She felt a pang of something more dangerous than anger, envy, and then doubt. If the Americans were such monsters, why would they care about a spoon? The propaganda had said the Allies wanted to exterminate the German people, but exterminators do not plant marigolds with their prisoners. The cognitive virus carried by these letters was potent because it was personal, because it was credible, and because it was utterly, boringly mundane. Meanwhile, back inside the camp, the women were undergoing their own final transformation. The combination of physical care, routine, small kindnesses, and the restorative power of creating something, a journal entry, a straight row of carrots, had rebuilt their sense of self. They were no longer just German prisoners. They were individuals again. Lena, who loved music. Marta, who missed her books. Gertrude, who understood soil. This re-individuation was the death knell for the Nazi ideology, which relied on the submersion of the self into the Volk, the collective. You cannot have a faceless, obedient mass when every woman in that mass is privately wondering if she should write about the spoon or the marigold in her next letter home. The Americans had, entirely without meaning to, reverse-engineered the process of indoctrination. The Nazis had used grand spectacles, roaring crowds, and apocalyptic rhetoric to dissolve the individual into the movement. The Americans used quiet, small, repetitive acts of decency to precipitate the individual back out of the wreckage. And once a person has been precipitated out, once they remember they have a self with preferences and memories and a favorite way to wear their hair, they cannot be dissolved again so easily. The final proof of this came not from the prisoners, but from the guards. There was no fraternization order lifted, no official change in policy. But as the weeks turned into months, the interactions became less stiff. A guard would see Gertrude watering her flowers and give a small, awkward thumbs up. Another, hearing Lena humming an old folk tune, would later say, "That was pretty." These were not betrayals of duty. They were involuntary acknowledgments of shared humanity. The guards, too, were young men far from home, scared and tired. In the silent, clean, orderly world of the camp, the women ceased to be abstract Nazis and became specific people. The quiet one, the one who smiled at the flowers, the one who always neatly folded her towel. And the guards ceased to be abstract monsters and became specific people. The tall one with the shy smile, the young one who missed his mother, the older one who had a daughter back in Ohio. This mutual, grudging rehumanization was the ultimate defeat for the propaganda machine. The machine dealt in archetypes. It could not compute the tall guard with the shy smile. It had no answer for him, so it fell silent. And in that silence, something unexpected grew, a fragile, wordless peace within the wire. The war outside was reaching its bloody climax, but inside the camp, the war was already over. It had been won with a bar of soap, a loaf of bread, a hairbrush, a packet of seeds, and a clean spoon. The weapons of mass construction had proven more powerful than the weapons of mass destruction. But the final act was still to come. The gates would have to open. The women would have to walk back into the world carrying their invisible wounds and their tangible bars of lemon soap. And they would have to face the real question: what do you do with the truth when everyone around you is still living the lie? The gates opened on a morning thick with the scent of damp earth and diesel fuel. The war in Europe was over, a fact that felt less like a victory and more like a sudden, deafening silence after a decade of noise. The women stood in their worn civilian clothes, clutching small bags that contained almost nothing of material value and everything of psychological weight. Inside each bag, wrapped in a scrap of cloth or tucked into a folded dress, was a bar of the lemon soap. Some had two. It was not a coordinated act of theft, it was a unanimous act of preservation. The soap was no longer just soap, it was a relic, a holy object from the quiet religion of basic decency they had practiced for months. It was proof that the world they had just lived in was real. The American guards and nurses lined up to see them off. There were no grand speeches, no handshakes for the cameras, just nods, silent looks that carried volumes, a recognition of shared time, of a strained peace forged in the most unlikely of circumstances. As the trucks rumbled to life, the women looked back not at a prison, but at a sanctuary. They looked at the barracks where they had slept without fear of bombs, at the shower block where they had wept under hot water, at the small garden plot, now verdant with lettuce and bright with marigolds. They looked at the Americans, those supposed monsters, who now just looked like tired men and women in uniform, their job here done. Then they turned to face the road ahead, leading back into the heart of a broken Germany. The journey was a descent into a different kind of shock. The camps had been islands of order in a sea of chaos. Now they were plunged back into the chaos. Cities were skeletal, landscapes of jagged rubble and ghostly standing walls. The people they passed had hollow eyes and moved with the lethargy of profound defeat. The air smelled of dust, decay, and a new terrible scent, the sweetish, cloying smell of ruined buildings and unspoken grief. Their homecoming was not heroic. It was awkward, painful, shrouded in a national shame that instantly became personal. They were not greeted as survivors, but as question marks. Where had they been? What had they done? And most dangerously, what had they seen? In the whispers of their neighbors, they detected a new suspicion. You were with them. You lived under their care. That care itself was now a mark of potential betrayal. In the face of this, the lemon soap in their bags became a secret, a guilty treasure. To use it was to risk the scent giving them away. To smell clean, to smell of American lemons in a world that smelt of ash and defeat, was to declare a dangerous allegiance. But they used it anyway. In the privacy of a shattered bathroom, with water drawn from a communal pump, they would unwrap the precious bar. The scent would explode in the damp air, a time machine in a molecule. For a few minutes, the rubble outside would fade. They would be back in the steam, clean, safe, and most paradoxically, free. Free from fear, free from hate. That memory, triggered by scent, became their psychological armor. The propaganda machine of the Reich was shattered, but its pieces were everywhere, sharp and dangerous. The old lies were still told, now as excuses or bitter jokes. We were betrayed. The world is against us. They always meant to destroy us. The women who had come back from the camps heard these lies and said nothing. But inside, they had an antibody. They had a lived sensory memory that contradicted the core of the Nazi myth, the myth of the inhuman other. They had met the other. The other had given them a clean spoon. The other had brushed their hair. The other had let them plant marigolds. This knowledge did not make them activists. It did not make them loud voices for reconciliation. It made them quiet. It made them certain in a world that had lost all certainty. Their resistance was not in speeches, but in small domestic acts. Gertrude, back in what was left of her town, scavenged flower seeds from abandoned lots and planted them in bomb crayons. She said nothing. She just planted. Lena, when she finally got a teaching job again, did not teach hatred. She taught her students the folk song she had hummed in the camp. Marta never got her voice back fully, but she started a small lending library with the few books she could find, creating a quiet space where people could escape, just as she had escaped into the notebook. Theirs was a peace built not on treaties, but on the stubborn, unshakable knowledge that the division between us and them was a fiction, that the real division was between those who would offer a bar of soap and those who withhold it. They had crossed that divide, and they could never go back.
They carried the scent of lemon as a reminder, and as a quiet, fragrant rebellion against the enduring stench of lies.
In the end, the most powerful peace treaty was never signed in a hall of mirrors. It was not etched on parchment or enforced by armies. It was written on the nervous system, in the language of sensation. It was the memory of heat on skin, the taste of real butter, the sound of a hairbrush moving through tangled hair, the sight of a green shoot in black soil, the crisp, impossible scent of lemon. These were the clauses of this silent treaty, and its signatories were not generals or statesmen, but thousands of ordinary women who learned a simple, devastating lesson. Humanity is not a nationality, it is a condition, and it can be offered or withheld by anyone. The Nazi propaganda machine was a masterpiece of ideological engineering. It was designed to dehumanize the enemy absolutely, to turn living, breathing people into abstract monsters. This was necessary to justify the unthinkable. The machine worked as long as the enemy cooperated by acting like a monster. But when the enemy did the opposite, when they acted with a care so mundane it was radical, the machine seized up. Its gears designed to process hatred could not process a clean towel. Its circuits wired for fury shorted out in the face of a patiently watered marigold. The Americans did not set out to break the propaganda machine. They set out to run a prisoner of war camp according to the Geneva Conventions, and perhaps their own personal sense of decency. In doing so, they accidentally authored the perfect counter-propaganda. Their message was not democracy is good. Their message was you are a human being. And that message, delivered not in words, but in hot water, fresh bread, and quiet respect, was immune to refutation. You cannot argue a person out of their own lived experience. The women who carried that experience back into Germany became carriers of a quiet truth. They did not lead marches. They did not publish manifestos. They simply lived with the memory of lemon soap in their nostrils. They rebuilt their lives, brick by brick, child by child, garden by garden, and in doing so, they rebuilt something else. The idea that a nation's character is not defined by its loudest speeches or its most powerful weapons, but by its smallest actions, by how it treats the vanquished, by whether it offers a bar of soap or withholds it. The story of free soap, hot showers, and the impossible scent is more than a curious footnote to the war. It is the core of a different kind of history. A history of the weapons we don't name when we tally victories. A history of the warmth that thaws frozen ideologies. A history that suggests that sometimes the most strategic thing you can do is also the most human. The women are all gone now. The camps are gone, returned to field or forest. The bars of soap, if any remain, are fragile relics in museums or attics. But the lesson remains, as sharp and clear as a lemon scent on a cold morning. It is a lesson for any time, for any conflict. You can build walls of hate with words. You can fortify them with fear, but they will always be vulnerable to the gentle, persistent, utterly ordinary forces of care. To the shower that offers warmth, to the hand that offers bread, to the simple, profound act of seeing the enemy not as a monster, but as a person who somewhere deep down just wants to be clean. The war was won with steel and fire, but the peace was woven from quieter stuff. It was woven from the threads of routine kindness, from the fabric of basic dignity, and it was held together, stitch by invisible stitch, by the memory of an impossible scent that proved beyond any doubt that even in the darkest of times, humanity has a fragrance all its own, and that fragrance, once smelled, is never forgotten. Today, if you stand in a certain museum in Berlin, you can see one of those bars of soap behind glass. It looks small, insignificant. Its color has faded. You cannot smell it through the case. But if you know the story, you can almost feel the warmth of the water, hear the quiet weeping in the steam, and sense the moment a mountain of lies began to crumble, not from a blast, but from a whisper of lemon in the air. That whisper changed everything. It still does.